Good afternoon to all. Good spring to you all. Thank you for joining us in this seminar, which is part of both the theories of regulation seminar and also the seminar in the context of Ma'avarim, Academia IL, which deals with academic citizenship. So thank you very much, Giliberto, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Let me introduce you to the audience. Most of them know you, but maybe the people who will watch the YouTube presentation won't, or do not know you. I will say that Giliberto is Professor of Public Policy at the University of Bologna, Italy. He was the director of the Italian Center of Research on Universities and Higher Education System between 2015 and 2021. Is the editor of Policy and Society, specialized in public administration, public policy analysis, comparative higher education. He's one of the leading researchers in public policy in Europe, and his research focuses on governance dynamics and performance of higher education and education policy design, policy change, policy instrument impact, the social role of political science, the policy impact of COVID-19, and leadership as embedded function of policymaking. He published many books that can be found online, and he kindly agreed to present his work today here, and I'm very happy and very grateful for that. So, Giliberto, please go in.
Okay. Good afternoon. May I start? Okay.
Sure.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here with this group of colleagues. I agreed with, sorry, I started to make confusion as usual here. I agreed with David that exactly because we are a few groups in presence online, it would be great to have not a formal speech, but a kind of conversation. So I have a PowerPoint presentation with a few points that I wanna present for your consideration. If you like, you can interrupt me, you can jump in, you can ask questions. So just to make it more comfortable, exactly because I think that we are all bored of this online stuff. So I really count on you to make this interactive. I should have a presentation to share. I hope you can see it.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So, and I have to, okay, so what I'm going to present, I'm going to present a few ideas I have been developing during the last year, so probably last 20 years, in which I have been working a bit on higher education governance changes. And I present some basic concepts of the field because I have assumed that the attendants could be not professionally expert of the field of higher education governance. And then I will present some few points on what has been the development of changes in governance in higher education. And I will present also a few data, whether this is the outline. The first point is a short definition of what is the governance mantra in reforming higher education. Then I will start focusing on the problem of governing university and the so-called traditional types of governance. I will say something on the ideational side of these reforms, on the instrumental sides, and on the results of these reforms that are hybridity mixes and national traditions. Let's start on what I define the governance mantra in reforming higher education. Personally, I think that in the last 3 decades we have had a governance mantra, a general governance mantra. Governance is one of the most used concept in the last 30 years. Like new public management and so on. So as I think we had this mantra in every other policy field, we had also in reform in higher education. So first of all, allow me to briefly define that what is the topic of this presentation. It is systemic governance in higher education, so no institutional governance. Systemic governance that we can generally define as the way through which higher education policy are coordinated through institutionalized arrangement and practices. We have seen that in the last 4 decades, what have been considered the inherited characteristics of a higher education system have been significantly changed due to governmental reforms. We had in the last 40 years, everywhere in the world, I would say, continuous governmental reforms of systemic governance in higher education. These have been planned reform. Very often some results have been unplanned or unexpected. However, it's quite clear that this reform happened, have been designed, and have been pursued under the pressure of big social economic processes. So we know these processes: massification, welfare state financial crisis, globalization, internationalization, whatever you like. We have this big macro phenomenon that have pushed governments to be more interested in designing policy on governance in higher education with respect to the past. In the past, in every country, we had few interventions of governments in higher education. In the last 3 or 4 decades, depends on the country, we had a continuous attention, or at least a continuous intervention by governments. These reforms, generally speaking, have modified not only the organizational characteristics of higher education. In many countries, a vocational higher education track has been created. In many countries, especially in continental Europe, universities have been given institutional autonomy. But this reform have significantly changed the way in which this system are coordinated and steered by the introduction of new forms of institutional accountability, evaluation, accreditation, performance funding, and so on. In this broad picture, it's better, I think, to stop for a moment and try to focus on what is the governance problem that governments have to deal with when thinking how to design systemic governance in higher education, how to change something, and so on. So let's shift from a general macro perspective to a very micro perspective. That is, let's focus on what I define the structural problem of governing universities. Because when we talk of governance system, we are talking, a national system usually, but this national system is composed by individual institutions, and universities, as those who are specialized in this field know, are sui generis institutions. And this being sui generis institutions explain why at a certain point the government decided to intervene in higher education and why it is so difficult to find solutions for what are supposed to be public problems in higher education. Why they are sui generis institutions? Because a university, like schools, are considered a typical loose coupling organization. Using the famous expression of Weik, they are form of organized anarchy. And this exactly because they are loose coupling institutions, universities are characterized by the following characteristics: causal indeterminacy, fragmented internal environment, and fragmented external environment. What does it mean? Causal indeterminacy means that the action of universities are characterized by an intrinsic ambiguity and uncertainty regarding means-ends relations and by a variety of contradictory goals. if you read the status of the general constitution of your university, of many universities, you can discover, for example, that university have the aspiration to pursue excellence in research, in providing freedom to teach, in contributing to the socio-economic development, in developing equity, accountability for their society, and so on. But on the same time, they are subdivided in a variety of academic disciplines, academic niches. Every discipline has its own mission, epistemological basis, and professional rules. So substantially, to try to understand what are the causes of internal processes is very, very, very complex, and very often it is a matter of chance and serendipity. Never forget, just to be clear on this point, that the concept of a garbage can system has been proposed by Marshall and Olsen 40 years ago, or 50 years ago, after two deep studies on higher education reform in Sweden in 1968, and after a deep research on the internal governance of American colleges. After these two research, these three giants of our discipline propose this new model, garbage can model. And the garbage can model is exactly based on causal indeterminacy. So this is something I have always liked of this field, the fact that a so relevant conceptualization comes from an empirical experience inside the university. Then university, exactly because they are loose coupled organizations, have a fragmented internal environment. That means that universities are composed by different academic tribes. These tribes constantly seek to defend their territories, using a metaphor of Tony Beecher, Academic Tribes and Territories, a beautiful book published in 1988. We know that there are various groups of students with different demands. There is the staff with different demands. So substantially, it's one of the most fragmented organizations that you can find, with internal groups having very, very different missions, goals, and these missions and goals very often are contradictory. Then the third characteristics of a university, like as loose coupling organization, is the external, the fragmented external environment. That means simply that university live in a context, in an environment from where they receive continuously very different contradictory types of demands. They are asked to help the local economic development. They are asked to do something respect to the technological application. They are asked to improve the quality of the stock of human capital. They are asked to contribute to the socialization and selection of social elite, and they are asked also to contribute to social mobility. So all in all, as we can see, there are interesting characteristics of these institutions.
Gilberto,
sorry?
Just a minute. You mentioned something about the garbage can model. What is this? I have never heard about this model before.
Is a decisional model proposed in a paper, I think, published in 1972, quoted by Cohen, March, and Olsen, that propose what we could define a kind of apparently irrational decision-making model, in which there is no linearity, in which actors do not have clear preferences, in which there are not clear decisional rules, in which preferences are completely endogenous, in the sense that actors shape their preferences through the interaction with the other actors, in which the final result is not determined. This is a type of decision-making model in which it could happen very often that there is no final decision, and in which it could usually the final criterion for deciding is not a specific rational criterion, but very often is chance. It happens that at a certain point we can find an agreement. So it's one of the most known decision-making models in public policy, but also in organization theory.
Okay.
Okay. Then I was.
So you say that universities are.
I'm sorry. I incidentally muted Jacob. Let me ask.
No, I'm not saying that Jacob, university are like this. I'm simply saying that this model of decision-making has been proposed after a couple of empirical research in university institutions. And personally, I have to say that this very often happens in a university. I'm saying this not only because I have studied in this field for many years, but also because I had institutional position in my university. I've been dean and so on, and I have, I would say, experienced that very often there is this process of garbage can inside the decision-making of university. However,
okay.
What I'm trying to say is that the loose coupling characteristics of universities complicates the institutional coordination that is their internal governance. And this also, however, explain why universities are capable to adapt and survive. The fact that they are loose coupling organizations means that their internal governance is very complicated. Intrinsically, they cannot behave like corporate organization, but exactly this dimension, if from on the one hand does not allow usually to take strategic decisions, on the other hand allow university to adapt and survive. Never forget that university is the most, I would say, the oldest institution, at least in the Western world, after the church. And this is something on which we should think. So exactly this point has been, I would say, the target of all this reform. At a certain point, governments decided that universities needed to, I would say, be more accountable, needed to do something more for the socio-economic needs of the society. And then all these reforms have tried substantially to change systemic governance, to push universities to behave as corporate organizations. So the main, I would say, target of all this reform has been, if you allow me, that one to tight a bit the loose couple characteristics of universities. Hope this is clear. Any questions on this? Great. This is I don't see this. This is the Barton-Clark triangle, and this is substantially a proposal to understand how systemic governance of a university system worked, I would say, in the past. This is a quite famous theoretical proposition proposed by Barton-Clark, who substantially proposed that systemic coordination in higher education system could be based on three general principles: state authority, market, and academic oligarchy. The idea was, okay, we could have a hierarchy in the sense that the state authority could prevail in steering a higher education system, like substantially could be France until before the reforms. Then we have market, that means a situation in which systemic coordination is guaranteed by competition between university institutions. And then you have the role of academic oligarchy. That means substantially that the strongest academic disciplinary groups could be those coordinating the system. There is something on which I want to be clear here, is that these three principles of systemic coordination that we could translate, I don't know, in a more modern language, in hierarchy, market, and network, for example, have been quite discussed in higher education literature. Why? Because all in all the countries look to belong to a mix of these criteria. To be clear, let's talk about the systemic governance in continental Europe before the reforms. It was an interesting situation. Why? Because institutions, that means universities as institutions, didn't have institutional autonomy at all, and the system was coordinated through a strict interaction between the central ministry and the most important academic disciplinary groups inside the university. So substantially you had a mix of two general principles of coordination. What is relevant, however, is exactly that according to this original conceptualization of principle of general coordination at the systemic level, only Anglo-Saxon institutions were considered capable to be autonomous. This is something that should be clear. Actually, we think that institutional autonomy is something that belongs to all the institutions, the university institutions. But before the reforms, university institutions were autonomous only in those systems in which there was, in a way or another, some market mechanism guaranteeing competition. And this was not the case in continental Europe, in many Asian countries, in many Latin American countries. Then we had, as I told, the fact that I would say it depends on the countries, but we can say between 50s and 70s of the past century or millennium, societies and governments started to take great interest in higher education because substantially they perceived to be in a global context of strong competition, and so they wanted more from university. They started to ask a major contribution to increase the quality of human capital, to I would say be more interested in doing something to support the socio-economic development of countries. So at a certain point, after decades, I would say, of lack of interest of governments with respect to university, I don't know if you know the expression ivory tower, that is a metaphor that very often it has been used to define university. We could say that this metaphor could be could represent the relationship between university and their own society for at least 1 century. But again, between 50 and 60s, governments starting to ask more to universities. They started to ask for a rapid increase of participation rates, and this is the process through which we shifted from an elitistic system to a massified system. They started to ask for a diversification of educational demands. So the government started to ask university every kind of education, not only general education, but not only specialized education, but also lifelong learning, distance learning courses, internationalization of courses, research training, and so on. They asked the university to go for greater knowledge generation, and they asked the university to develop training and technology for local community, and so on. It has been, I would say, sorry, it has been really a long but deep process through which the relationship between society and governments and their own higher education system is really changed. We can think to this kind of change in the state-university relationship is something that we could really define a radical change. What have been, or which kind of ideas have developed governments to reforms, to try to redesign systemic governance in a way that university could be pushed towards what were considered the most relevant socio-economic needs. So let's talk about the kind of ideas they have used for many, just to introduce the concept of policy ideas. It's very, very, very rough. There are colleagues here that could talk weeks about what is a policy idea. I have chosen a couple of definitions. A policy idea is a programmatic set of statements of cause and effect concerning a specific policy problem together with a policy theory or method for influencing this causal relationship. America and Kasbergen. Peter Hall suggests that ideas and standards are not only the goals of policy and the kind of instruments that can be used to attain them, but also the very nature of the problems they are meant to address. So, what have been the ideas that government have focused on and on which they have developed these reforms? There is a long list. First of all, institutional autonomy. I want to underline again that outside the Anglo-Saxon world, until 30, 40 years ago, universities were not autonomous. Academic guilds were really autonomous. The central ministry was had a strong power, but institutions were not autonomous. Universities had no autonomous power. Usually, most of the decisions were taken at the center of the system through a kind of negotiation with the local groups of academics. So the pivotal idea outside the Anglo-Saxon world was, let's give universities institutional autonomy. Then the other side of this idea is institutional accountability. So we said, if we give them autonomy, finally, we should find a way to make them accountable. Which is not simple. Why? Because as we will see, there are different ways through which autonomous university institution can be made accountable. Then another big idea of this reform has been competition, based on the rough conceptualization that, you know, if you have autonomous institutions, and our policy are well designed, then they will behave like corporate organization, and then they could compete to have more sources, the best professor, and so on. Another idea was evaluation. So that means evaluation of research, but also in some countries systemic evaluation of teaching. There has been this new idea that had never appeared before 3 decades ago of performance funding, the idea to give a certain percentage of public funding to universities based on their performance, either on teaching or research. And then there has been another idea, has been privatization. Privatization is an idea that has not been really implemented in the Western world in this sense, but privatization has been an idea that has characterized, for example, the governance reform in Latin America, where many governments have decided to allow the development of a big private sector in higher education. And then the final idea was the idea of studying at a distance. The idea was, okay, it's time to shift from the state control model, where the state was pivotal in steering the system, to the so-called state supervising model. If the idea was substantially the steering at the distance is a label through which all the other ideas are put together. The idea of the steering at the distance is that substantially, if we have given autonomy to university, if we have a bit of competition, if we have evaluation and so on, then the state could simply, I would say, stay at the distance and drive the system using specific instruments of performance funding, specific instruments of evaluation, and so on. So a few examples of a few illustration of the application of these ideas in European countries, and when I say European, I mean substantially continental European, also Nordic European. I would say Europe without UK substantially, a bit Ireland. Governments have, in the last decades, have abandoned the state control model in favor of steering university from a distance. In some countries, both in Europe and in Asia, the government has also, governments have also radically changed the institutional arrangement of universities by abandoning the traditional democratic procedure for elected institutional leaders. One of the ways through which governments have tried to make more stronger the capacity of university to be autonomous and then to behave like a corporate organization has been to change by law the internal institutional governance. So in all these countries I have cited, but also in others, the governments has changed the law to make possible for university to have rectors and presidents appointed and not elected, deans and director of department appointed and not elected. In the English-speaking world, the governments have increased their intervention and regulation despite a tradition of institutional autonomy. Here we have a kind of historical divide, in the sense that historically in the Anglo-Saxon countries, university existed as an institution, and they were, for different historical reasons, and they were autonomous. To make them more, I would say, more capable to pursue the social, economic and political goals of governments in these countries, especially in UK, Australia and New Zealand, governments have increased their intervention and regulation. For example, in UK, Australia and New Zealand, government have created national agency for the assessment of research and teaching, and so on. At the same time, public universities in the US have been strongly encouraged to adopt a more competitive stance to obtain more funding from private sources in a substantial process of marketization. In Asia and in Latin America, there have been more complex dynamics due to different economic tradition, political context, and financial situations. It is important to underline that in these last 3 decades in India, in East Asia, and also in many Latin American countries, we can find a high number of private institutions. What happened in these countries? Under the pressure of massification in these countries, in this continent, governments to maintain what the perceived quality of public systems preferred to design incentives for the establishment of private institutions. So there are countries in which the numbers of private institutions are really, really high. But again, this has been a conscious, right or wrong decision based on the idea that government wanted to maintain, to keep what they perceived to be the high quality of their elitistic public system. If you go to Brazil, for example, Brazil is an excellent case in which a leftist policy 20 years ago has contributed to push an incredible increasing of the number of private institutions, those that are institutions in which substantially you pay low fees because they are mass institution, and it has been exactly because the perception of the leftist Brazilian government was exactly that. They wanted to maintain what was perceived a very elitistic, selective, high-quality public system. So in every country, the new ideas have been applied in a way or in another. So we can find evaluation, institutional accountability, competition applied in every country. But obviously, we cannot speak of convergence toward a similar mode of systemic governance of higher education, simply because there has been a common usage of the same idea. We can make the mistake, for example, to think that NPM has been applied everywhere, or that everywhere neoliberal policy in higher education have been introduced, if we can do this only if we don't focus on the way through which these general or generic ideas have been applied in designing reform. My main thesis is that substantially everywhere some forms of evaluation have been introduced, as well as some form of competition, but the fact that in every country you could find a bit of competition, a bit of evaluation, and so on, does not mean that there is a kind of neoliberal convergence in this policy. And we can grasp this by focusing on the policy and instruments adopted to design these reforms.
Gilberto, may I ask one question now? Probably you are going to answer it later, but I give you the opportunity to drink and to have some air. So the question is, okay, there was no convergence, but can we say that the system now is better in terms of academic achievements of the students, the lifestyle of the welfare of the faculty, the accountability of the system because of those reforms? To what extent they were successful?
Okay, you have anticipated something on which I did not want to talk. Let's say in this way, because you are putting many questions, and so it's quite clear that we do not have this kind of general analysis of, let's call it, policy performance of these governance changes. This is the real point. In the sense, this is one of the problems, I think, that we have in public policy. We are so interested in explaining processes, in explaining outputs, but with the justification that there is not necessarily a direct causal path between policy output and policy outcome. We very often try to avoid to treat policy outcomes. So I can reply to your question saying that according to a research I have done with colleagues comparing systemic performance in teaching in 12 European countries, where you had proper forms of teaching and research evaluation, you can find an improvement of the, I would say, of the number of citizens of a specific age cohort with a university degree. This is something on which I have a high level of certainty. Then on the other dimension, there is not enough research, you know what I mean? And this depends on the countries. For example, regarding the question of the situation of the academic staff, we perfectly know that the number of academics without the tenure is really increased in many countries. You know what I mean? This is a clear product of certain forms of competition. Or, for example, if you have a look to the use of research evaluation in those countries in which research evaluation of the system really matter in terms of percentage of public funding given to university. And around the world, there are two countries in which national research assessment really matters in terms of percentage of public funding, and these countries are UK and Italy substantially. You can see that usually the same university win a relevant percentage of the public funding. So frankly speaking, in terms of effects, there is not enough research. But there is, I would say, a relevant empirical evidence is that countries intervene, government intervenes very often in changing governance rules in their university system, very often in a contradictory way. We have done an interesting research on comparing the trajectories of reforms in 16 European countries, and we have discovered that, I would say, it's not clear, but this is a point of fact, that there is a continuous reversal over time of the decision respect to governance in higher education. I don't know if I have replied to your question.
Yes, you did.
Okay.
I have more questions, but I'll let you go.
Okay, on. But if I think that I'm not taking all your, I'm taking too too much
No,
time.
you're doing excellent. You're doing excellent. Go on.
Okay. What we can say about these reforms over time, there are different interpretations. In the sense, if you have a look to the literature, there are those seen, there is all the countries are going for steering at the distance. There are other scholars saying, there has been a prevalence of neoliberal reforms, and there are other scholars say, no steering at the distance, no neoliberal reform. There is a process of re-regulation of governance in comparative higher education. But what emerges is that pure types of governance arrangement do not actually exist. The main principle of coordination, a hierarchy, market, and network have been combined in various ways, and thus also the related policy ideas. And substantially, all governance arrangements have become a kind of ideational hybrids and are characterized as working through policy mixes. And we have, with other colleagues in the last year, assessed these mixes, adopting a quite famous typology of instruments, regulation, expenditure, and taxation. This is the system we have codified. Substantially, we have, I would say, conceptualized and classified all the types of instruments adopted to design governance reform in higher education according 4 general families of instruments. We have also divided these instruments in those instruments that represent opportunities that favor behavior for university, and instruments that favor, or better, that represent constraint in university. I don't want to bore you on this. What emerges from this analysis? That all the countries have tried to go for a steering at the distance mode of governing their higher education system, but that this steering from a distance mode is not a unique mode, but it has been, I would say, interpreted according to the national tradition in at least 3 different modes that in a way or another can be considered hybrids of the steering at the distance mode. That means some ideas of this general mode, but I would say with other ideas and instruments. So we have distinguished a performance-oriented mode that is a systemic governance system in higher education when there is a significant percentage of public funding based on the result of research, many regulations and administrative procedures, student support based on loans, and relatively high tuition fees. We have distinguished a re-regulated mode where there are many procedural constraints on the main activities: recruitment, promotion, postdoc, teaching content, and student admission. There is a proceduralization of the quality assurance. There is a certain use of target funding and performance funding. There is an average low public funding and low tuition fees. And then we have distinguished a goal-oriented mode of steering systemic governance. That is a mode in which clear systemic goals are stated by governments. There is a high public funding. There is a strategic use of performance funding, and the student support is mostly based on grants, and there is no or low tuition fees.
Before you go, can you give us some indication of which countries stay?
I'm coming.
There? I think the okay, go on.
Okay.
Please.
To give you some example, according to our, I would say, empirical classification, in Europe, it appears that only England and partially Italy fits this hybrid, while in America and in Asia, performance is a pillar criterion for governing higher education systems. So we have a few examples in Europe we have many examples of performance-oriented mode in Americas. That means substantially, I would say, Latin American except Brazil. And in Oceania, there is New Zealand that has been the pioneer of shifting towards performance-oriented, this performance-oriented hybrid. What is interesting is that if we focus only in the small Europe, we all very often discuss that our system are performance-oriented and so on. But if we enlarge the perspective, this is not the case, and we have really few cases in Europe compared to other continents. The re-regulatory mode, can be considered a recurrent trend in European countries. Many, and also in many Asian, in some Asian countries like China, Japan, and Malaysia. Frankly speaking, I do not have enough information because there are not enough empirical work to better understand if this framework could be applied to Latin American countries or in some states of US or provinces of Canada. For example, at my knowledge, Quebec in the last years has clearly adopted a re-regulative mode. As you know, in federal countries, and especially in US and in Canada, higher education governance is completely in the power of the state provincial government. The goal-oriented mode is a strange hybrid because according to our data and our information, it is present substantially in Nordic European countries. Probably this is not the case that the 4 Nordic European countries are the motherland of the broad, the most important, most dense forms of welfare state. But this hybrid is also prevalent in cities like Singapore and Hong Kong before, I would say, what started to happen in the last 2 years. For your interest, this is how instruments constraining institutional behavior and instruments offering opportunities to university institutional behavior have developed in 25 years in 16 European countries. And what is obviously is these are aggregate data, but the aggregate data in these 16 years, it's very, very interesting because we have clearly had a development of constraints and a decrease of instruments adopted offering opportunities to university institutions. This substantially means that in Europe, the re-regulatory mode I would say, started to develop in most of the countries. No, sorry, I have some point of conclusion. Governance in higher education undergoes ongoing process of changes. Very often there are not partisan preferences. What we have discovered by something that we have not still published yet, always in these 16 European countries, is that we have tried to find any kind of correlation, relationship between the change of government, the change of coalitions, to understand if in this long-lasting process of changing governance in higher education, there is a relevant role of partisan preferences, and we didn't find any minimal proof of this. So this is interesting because it's clear that there are usually in every country, there are more relevant political issues, but to find no relevant or small, relationship between partisan preferences and governance reforms made in the last 25-30 years in higher education is very, very interesting. It looks that change in governance is driven by contextual and contingent logic. So we made the hypothesis that there is a kind of effect of loose coupling characteristic of universities. And so the fact that every time there is a new policy intervention, the intrinsic organizational nature of university is capable to be resilient against this policy intervention. We have seen that hybridity is prevailing, and we have seen that substantially this hybridity allows a big variety of assessment by observers about the characteristics of the actual governance modes. So the real point is that exactly because this structural hybridity of systemic governance in higher education, the ideational map, the cognitive maps of the observers makes the difference in terms of assessment of interpretation of what's going on, which is a bit a mess from a scholarly point of view. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Giliberto. And we'll take now questions that comes first from the text, starting with Moshe Maor, and then going to Claudio. And then if others want to come in, please come in. So starting with Moshe, and we will take a few questions or comments at this before you answer because of the limitation of the time. So Moshe first, and then Claudio, and then
thank you. Thank you, Giliberto, for a very stimulating presentation. My question is a theoretical one. I wonder to what extent concepts from historical institutionalism, like gradual change that may lead to radical change, for example, layering, conversion, drift, displacement, and exhaustion, could provide some more theoretical underpinning for the process of systemic higher education reform. I can give you an example. You have the 6 dimensions. One of them is a reform of institutional autonomy of higher education. Now, you can examine comparatively whether the reform of institutional autonomy of higher education was implemented by layering, conversion, and so on.
Yes, may I reply immediately? Okay, it's quite clear if you go for a small number of cases analysis, you can do this, you know what I mean? So I have done something, some empirical research on Italian reforms, Dutch reforms, and then I can apply and it works. But if you try to increase the number of cases, first it becomes problematic. We did with the data we had, and we have used, for example, the types of welfare system and of higher education, previous higher education system, you know, as variables that could explain this path dependence. It didn't work. So the real point is that if you go for a small number of cases analysis, so you reconstruct the evolution of higher education governance in Italy, in the Netherlands, in UK, you can apply these concepts and they could explain something. But if you try to do a more, I would say, a comparative research increasing the number of cases, especially if you are interested to go towards more than 20, it's more problematic to apply this concept.
Thank you. And Claudio, please.
Thank you, Giliberto. I very much like the cross-country variation and then the effort you made to describe some of the groups of the countries that come together once you've done your original analysis. And this is something that I have found myself in another project where I did my research, and then the countries were falling in baskets that were not really the ones I expected. So the question is, what is the theoretical approach, construct that makes sense of the cross-country variation? One would not imagine Italy and the UK, for example, in the same set, but the findings that are accurate, granular, precise, tell us that. I wonder whether your findings in terms of variation are compatible more with something like state traditions, varieties of capitalism, families of political economies, or institutional theories, or perhaps it's Giliberto's theory. I mean, that is economy of policy. And there is a theory that says that Italy and the UK go together. I like the fact that they do not conform to the classic expectations, which means that we should not use all the times the classic expectations. And I say, oh yes, okay, the liberal coordinated economies, blah blah blah, but something original. So I praise the originality, but I think it would be nice to have also an intuition or a theory that explains the variation across the groups. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for the question, Claudio. It's clear that, in the research we did on 16 countries, there are two strange countries, partially outlier countries, that are Italy, that is partially, I have simplified in the presentation, that partially belongs to the performance-based mode and partially belongs to the re-regulated mode. It's okay. And the Netherlands is another partial outlier because partially belongs, I would say, on some dimension, on some instruments, it belongs to the Nordic countries. On other instruments, it belongs to the re-regulated countries. It's okay. So the real problem here is that when you go for as you have to call it a granular analysis, when you go to check the instrument, it's quite clear that you can find this, I would say, partial outlier. And so it's quite clear that, but this was a part of the research we have not finished. At that point, you should go for a more case-based analysis to understand something. This is my point, because using, we try to use, as I told you, different, I would say, different theories to do this comparison between 16 countries, and nothing works. So I have no theory, I have a problem. I have an empirical problem. So I'm not saying that there is a certain point I thought, okay, this cannot, or we made a mistake, I don't know, in coding the data, and this could be the case, but we have tried and retried. Or at a certain point, I thought, come on, it's simply by chance, you know what I mean? And then we are still thinking about that. The real problem is that if we go, and we are doing on in-depth case analysis, we miss this medium-high number of cases dimension, you know what I mean? So I'm still thinking about that. However, I have not a personal theory. I have, I would say, a theoretical problem coming from this. Put in another way, how is possible, or why at a certain point Italy is the only country together with UK that have decided to invest, to give so much of the public funding to university by this tool? You know, this is a serious question. You know, it's in other cases, this didn't happen. We know that there are dozens of countries around the world that give money to university according to something like the national research exercise, but it's a small percentage of money, you know what I mean? So I don't have a response to you. And so if you can help me, I'm here, you know what I mean?
Thank you. And now for Romulo, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Giliberto. This is Romulo from Agder in Norway.
Hi.
A short comment, because I know there's a lot of people waiting in the question. You mentioned Burton Clark, and one of the things that Burton Clark says is that all the higher education systems have an inherent tension between order and disorder. And of course, attempts at fostering one tend to create unintended effects on the other, right? I mean, here in Norway, governance attempts, the introduction of volumetric has substantially increased research productivity, but has enhanced the tensions that exist between research groups, between top universities, as you also mentioned in the UK, the haves and the have-nots, and it has affected the traditional egalitarian orientation, of Nordic academia. And related to that, one of the things you mentioned was autonomy. And I wonder whether we could zoom in a little bit more, because there's at least two different types of autonomy. There is the procedural and there's the substantive, right? So the what of higher education and the how of higher education. And my understanding, at least in the Nordic context, is that most of the reforms in the last 15 to 20 years, many of them NPM and post-NPM inspired, have primarily restricted the substantive autonomy of universities, right, through the contractual arrangements, performance indicators, and output elements, while at the same time enhancing or fostering procedural autonomy, right? Assuming that now we have these strong managers in place, they know what to do with this autonomy. And then the question is, what do you think this will do in terms of the classic balance between order and disorder that, to go back to my earlier comment, that Clark is talking about, particularly in the context of adaptability and resilience that you touched upon, which I'm very interested. Thank you.
Oh, well, thanks for Romulo for this question. Yes, I completely agree. In most countries around the world, government have given more procedural autonomy than substantial autonomy, but it is rational from their point of view, because their main goal is to push university to pursue some societal goals, and so goals are established by the governments, and then I give you procedural autonomy. Oh, there are other countries, the more re-regulated, in which also procedural autonomy has decreased a bit. I think that the consequence of this in terms of order and disorder is that at a certain point the capacity or the resilience capacity of university, put in another way, the different institutional logics working inside the university are capable, I would say, to manage also this lack of autonomy, of substantial autonomy, you know what I mean? Because in a way or another, exactly because there are some relevant general goals established by the government, usually what happens is that those, let's say it in another way, those academic groups inside a specific institution that are more more close to this goal will work on that, while the other groups can continue to work on their things, you know what I mean? So in a way or another, this, let's call it, I don't like the word, but let's call it resilience. It's helping universities to maintain a certain, I would say, internal institutional logic differentiation, exactly because they are loose coupled system, you know what I mean? So exactly because they are very, very differentiated internally, when the government propose a goal, you are sure that there will be some groups of your academics that will be capable to pursue that goal, you know what I mean? And then the others could go ahead doing their things. So I think that in a way or another, there will be not more disorder, although it's quite clear that what is going on in many countries now is that exactly because the new goals of government are funded more than the other goals, there could be some internal conflicts, you know what I mean? It's typical between the groups of those academics working more on applied research and those working more on humanities, for example. You can have this, this conflict, but very often universities find the balance. Very often it could happen, there are experiences in many countries in which if certain disciplines get more money from the government because they are doing applied research, then there will be an internal distribution, not pairing completely, but giving some balance, some incentive to those who are not doing applied research.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Gilberto. I know that there are more questions, and if you agree, I will do something that I'm innovating. I will make you co-host. I make you the host, and if you can stay a few more minutes with the others, please do. And I will leave for my teaching duties. So I'll make you an host, and you can limit the times that you are open for discussion, but I don't want to stop the discussion. I just want to do my stuff. So thank you very much, Gilberto. Thank you very much, all. Pleasure to have you and to get to know you better.
Hi.
See you later. Bye-bye.